I didn't see you out there. Were you doing remote worship?
Yeah, my wife wasn't feeling very well this morning.
Okay.
So we stayed home and I tuned in remotely. But it worked out for me. I got to watch the first half of the London football game and then I switched it over to church. So there we go.
There you go. Well, that's the beauty of the online worship. That's why it's there. Welcome, everybody, to the next edition of the 1135 podcast, ministry of the First United Methodist Church of Wichita Falls. My name is John McClarty, and I'm one of the pastors at the church, the one who preaches most Sundays, and I'm here with Jeff Harris, who's a member of the congregation, and it's our privilege today to continue our conversation based on the sermon series that I've been working on, Faith Ways, Richard Foster's book, Streams of Living Water. Today, the social justice tradition. Jeff, social justice.
Oh boy. Yeah, it's funny. So I was taking notes as I was watching you preach today, and right in the middle of your sermon, I just made a note in the margin of my notebook. It's like, man, this is complicated. And then 30 seconds later, you said, it's so complicated. So we're in agreement.
It is.
So what makes it so complicated, John? I mean, it's in the gospel. It's part of being a Christ follower. How do we start unraveling this thing?
I think a couple of things. I think, first of all, it's complicated because it's hard. It's hard work to be the kind of neighbor that Jesus talks about wanting us to be. It's just difficult. And sometimes we just don't want to do it. It gets in our way. It gets inconvenient.
Sure.
It gets, it just kind of messes with us in a lot of ways. And I think it also gets complicated because social justice as a Christian practice sometimes gets all tied up with political ideas or cultural ideas and conversations that we have and difficult things that we wrestle with in society. And then it causes us to, we've got to take sides, we've got to align ourselves with whatever our side says we align ourselves with. And I mean, I feel like I danced around this all day long today in the sermon with just, this is not a political thing. This is not a government thing. This is not even a legal thing in terms of social justice as we understand it from a Christian standpoint. But it's still, all those little buzzwords are there.
Right.
And we get caught up in that. And then that makes it harder for us to then engage with the practice of putting our faith in action as Jesus commanded us to do. Not just think about our faith, not just love people with our hearts, but to really be the hands and feet of Christ. And that's hard.
Help me flesh out a little bit when we talk about social justice. What is social justice and what is not social justice? Like, if I'm trying to figure this out and I want to follow the gospel closely and I want to wade into this stream, what am I looking to do and how is it different than maybe what I hear in political talk or those kind of things?
Social justice begins with the understanding that every person is made in the image of God, and therefore every person has the right as a child of God to the abundant life that Jesus envisioned and promised for us. And so any system that's set up to where some people benefit and some people don't, and even some people benefit at the expense of others, is not a just system. It's not an equitable system. We're not talking about everybody gets the same, but we are talking about everybody has access to the opportunities, access to be able to choose for themselves this life that Christ calls us into. And anything that gets in the way of that then would not be just. Then after that, it's this understanding that because of who Jesus is, and because of what Jesus calls us to be as Christians, loving my neighbor, loving God with all of my heart, mind, and soul, and loving my neighbor as myself means that I don't get to set up systems and structures that keep some people on the margins and intentionally keep some people away from or deny them access to the full privileges of what it means to experience that abundant life in Christ.
So what if I'm not setting up those systems? I'm just benefiting from them. I may not even be aware in the way that I'm benefiting from them.
And you and I, as two, one a little bit older than the other, white guys, we are the beneficiaries of a lot of things in our society that we didn't have to work really hard for. We didn't create systems that discriminate. We didn't create systems that discourage or keep others away, but we live into them every day. And so part of social justice then is simply awareness.
Okay.
And so I think maybe the first thing for people like you and me to recognize is that there has been privilege, and to recognize that there are other people whose journeys have been far more challenging and who have had to overcome far more barriers based on their gender or the color of their skin or their financial resources or whatever those may be. And simply recognize that not everyone's path to achievement in this world has been, a flat and smooth and straight journey. Some people have had to really kind of overcome a whole lot of things that have been put in their way.
Sure.
And then say, okay, so what can we do about that? How can I be a part of making sure that there are pathways to achievement and success in this life that are not obstructed by institutionalized systems that have created an unlevel playing field for people?
One of the things I really noticed in your sermon, you had your obligatory John Wesley quote in there today. Something about how social justice is the natural outflowing of a mature Christian, which I thought was spot on. It seems to be something where we can be aware and we can be active when we come across things that need our attention and that are in our sphere of influence. But they happen somewhat naturally as a byproduct of us trying to live a life that honors Jesus. I thought that was a great point, as well as that it's simply a reflection of God's love within us. When it comes to social justice, dude, I don't even know where to start. It sounds so complicated. It sounds so gargantuan.
Yeah, it is.
That I don't even know where to go with it. But at the same time, I know that I can live my life in such a way that the image of God in me responds to the image of God in others, to treat them in a way that honors them and my Creator and my Savior.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about developmental stages and developmental stages of faith and faith development. There's an evolution of justice that happens, I think, in our lives as well, where we begin in a very individualized kind of way. We think of justice in terms of fairness. Little kids, when you've got two kids in the house and one of them gets something that the other one, that's not fair, that's not fair. I mean, we understand the concept of justice from a pretty early age as it applies to ourselves and what we need. And then it expands to the people around us, the people in our circles. So the justice in my circles, and that becomes just us, and making sure that my group is represented and has access and gets what they need. And then the third evolution of that development is then this concept of justice for all. And what does it mean for all people to live in a fair and just and equitable kind of society? What does it mean for all people to be treated with kindness and compassion and mercy? And to start with the premise that, as you said, the image of Christ exists in others as it is in us, and our job is to recognize that and to call that out.
Right. So what would you say to someone who's wanting to become more maybe aware and active in the realm of social justice, but they're concerned maybe they'll be taken advantage of, or maybe it'll cost them some social status or some relational issue if they're seen as too weak, merciful, giving, those kind of things?
Yeah. Well, I think the first piece of advice I would give is to say, well, what do you see when you look at the Gospels? What do you see of Jesus? I mean, this is a person who is God incarnate, who had all power and all knowledge and was intentionally, deliberately self-limiting in what Jesus would do and say, ultimately allowing himself to be beaten and nailed to a cross. But everything about Jesus embodied the strength and the power of God's love. And yet to outside observers, it did look weak at times. And so I think, if that's ultimately what you're worried about as you step into a life of wanting to advocate for justice, you're in good company. There are a lot of folks that have been in that world, but you also recognize that many times that comes with a price, where you lose friends over the stances that you take and over the issues that you advocate for. You lose social standing or influence, and you align yourselves where you're speaking truth to power. Well, power may not like being spoken truth to. And it's also exhausting and becomes overwhelming. And so I would encourage people to recognize that, as I quoted in the sermon, that the arc of the moral universe is long. It bends toward justice. It ultimately reaches justice, but it's a long, long journey. And history has shown that it's got obstacles and landmines all throughout, and it's never quite finished. And again, as I said in the sermon, solving one problem often creates another one.
Right.
And so it's hard to keep up sometimes.
It's almost like a hydra sometimes.
Sometimes it can feel like that.
One of the things that you said in the sermon that captured my thoughts was when you're talking about where to begin, because it does seem like a daunting task. And the first thing you said was to never underestimate what God might do through you.
Yeah.
And you appealed to the scriptures, right, where we see God using, just look in the lineage of Jesus that's recorded in Matthew and Luke and the who's who.
That's right.
We call them heroes now, but in their lifetime, they may not have been quite considered that, right?
Right.
But then you also threw out names maybe you weren't even aware. You threw out Jesus, and you threw out Gandhi, and you threw out MLK, and it's like, yeah, those three guys belong on the Mount Rushmore of social justice. I'm not sure my picture's ready to be hung next to theirs on that. But really, where do we start? If we want to figure this thing out and start contributing to this realm, there's so much misinformation out there, John. How do we know who to trust? How do we know where to look to find anything?
I wish I could tell you, because you're right. So much out there is fabricated and deep fakes and can't get the stories straight. I personally think it starts with not with what's happening out there and not what you're seeing on the news. And you can get really caught up in international stories and even stories that are happening in other cities. But really, I think a great starting point is get to know people in your neighborhood, get to know people in your own community, and find out from somebody who's living life here, what is it like to be you? What is it like to navigate these systems? We have people who come in the church, fairly often looking for help, and there are degrees to which we're set up to do those things, and we have community partners all over the place that we do a lot of work with. But as we're kind of assessing what the need is and how to best help a person, the starting point is, tell me about yourself. Tell me about your story. How did you get here? What's life like for you? Someone who's trying to navigate the social service sector with mental health challenges, and these are real challenges. But it's a whole lot easier to think of it and to think of ways of dealing and interacting with the structures that are in place and the ways that we help people when we're talking about real people that we know, people whose names we know. I think that's a really important place to start. There are reputable news sources out there. There are certainly many that have, they have their agendas and they're telling their stories from their particular perspectives. Not everybody's like that, but you do have to be very discerning about what you see. Don't just take what you see on Facebook at face value. You've got to verify your sources. You've got to test that story against other things. The satire sites are funny and they're great, but they're so well done that it often blurs the line. So you just can't get outraged over every little thing that you see, because so much of that may not be true.
Sure.
But when it is true, and when you're able to verify something that really is happening, and it's something that you care deeply about, then figure out ways to involve yourself in that. As I listed in the sermon, what are some other options that you have in terms of engaging with that particular problem, calling attention to it, getting involved, getting elected to an office so that you can, solve the problem from the inside. All these different things can be done, but again, they take work. And I think that's part of the challenge again, is how much work it takes.
I like the idea of starting, not to minimize the problem, but at the micro level instead of the macro, where you're looking at international problems. I'm not going to solve the problems between, that's going on in Gaza right now here in Wichita Falls.
Right.
But I can be an ear and a voice and an advocate for those who might need it here in Wichita Falls. And one of the things I really appreciate about our church is that I feel like I can have honest conversations with people in our church who may not agree with me on some issues, whether they're politically or whatever, but we can have an honest conversation because they know my character and I know theirs.
Yeah.
Whereas the influencer on TikTok, I don't know what they're trying to do other than create a brand.
Right.
The news correspondent on cable news trying to get famous.
Right.
Right. We're trying to live life together.
Yeah.
So we can be honest and approach each other in a real genuine way.
Absolutely.
And maybe help tilt perspectives for each other in such a way to make a difference.
Yeah. Starting out at the local level, again, makes it makes it personal, makes it real. That's where Jesus spent his whole ministry, was right in the local level. I had a colleague of mine who told this great story once about the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I touched on just kind of briefly in the sermon. He talked about how it's great that the Samaritan man, went and helped the guy that gotten beat up, bandaged his wounds, took him to a place where he could get care, paid for that care, and helped him out. He talked about how justice is then the next step after that. This is a known street where robbers and thieves hang out and just wait for the next victim to come. What if we petitioned the city to erect streetlights up and down this street? What if we're able to get CCTV cameras installed in these places to help prevent crime and help reduce the opportunity for a bandit to hurt people in this place? What can we do at the government level or at the institutional level to make this a safer place so that the beatings and the robberies don't continue to happen? That's an element of justice, where we're looking a little further upstream to see causes of these problems and trying to solve them there so that it reduces the problem that happens.
I like that. In your sermon today, you mentioned your experience in South Africa. And you talked about, what was the name of the mountain that you said?
Table Mountain.
Table Mountain, okay. So how it would be real easy, to be at the top of Table Mountain and look down and not see any of the problems and those kind of things. But then you have to get down from the mountain in order to get your hands dirty and help solve those issues. Or at least contribute to that. And it made me think of Moses in Exodus. What it must have been like for him on Sinai, receiving the 10 Commandments face to face as much as he could be with God, looking down, thinking, oh, this is going to be great as I bring these down to the people. And he gets down there and just they're
a mess.
Golden calf, leadership has been a disaster, etc. So just what it must have been like for him to think, was this all for nothing? And I feel like maybe sometimes we can feel that way too. What possible difference could my tiny little contribution make? What did you think in South Africa? What kind of difference do you think you made there? What were you doing there?
Oh, I don't think I made any difference at all in South Africa. In fact, I'm quite aware that I was on Table Mountain. I'm there with a whole lot of other people enjoying a beautiful day, and a day that we happen to have a good clear view of the city, and that you're looking out over this city of 3 million people that nobody knows that I'm there. They don't care that I'm there. I'm looking out over the southern Atlantic Ocean as it's surrounding the Horn of Africa, and the ocean doesn't care that I'm there. And so, from that part, it was super, super humbling to be in that environment. So incredibly beautiful, and just this great, great scene. And Cape Town is a lot like a lot of places I've been in Latin America too, where some of the touristy areas are so super nice. And if that's all you saw of a place like Cape Town, you'd think, oh my gosh, this place is amazing. But just on the other side of the street, just on the other block, just outside of town, you've got some of the worst poverty you can possibly imagine, as people are living in one room, little tin shack houses, and it floods when it rains, and it's just horrible. And so you've got this really sometimes inconvenient juxtaposition of affluence and wealth and beauty with poverty and suffering and people's lives who are not experiencing very much in terms of material success in life and just kind of hanging on, surviving. And so how do we reconcile that? Because on the one hand, the economy drives a lot of the services that are provided for poor people, but it also kind of sometimes keeps people locked into a system of dependence and never able to sort of rise out of that.
If I could summarize down to like your thesis question, it felt like to me, is my life bringing healing or harm to others? Here's my question though. Is it one or the other? Or is there a neutral ambivalence that we sometimes wander through life with, where we're not helping people, we're not harming them either, but we're definitely not helping. And we're just kind of in our own little bubble, content to be there, live our own little lives, take care of our own little problems. What do you think?
I think those that are deeply immersed in social justice tradition would say that doing nothing is the equivalent of doing harm. That silence is complicity, and inaction is complicity with structures that are doing harm. Personally, I don't know that I can go there that far entirely, at least not all the time. I think sometimes we just simply we don't act until we really know what we need to be doing.
Right.
And so inaction isn't always indifference. Sometimes inaction is being patient and waiting to see what the right course needs to be, because you can react and overreact all day long.
Absolutely.
We see that happening constantly. But I do think that ultimately the goal is for our lives to make a positive contribution to the world and make a positive contribution in other people's lives. I think that ultimately that's what living into our Christian faith is about. Jesus took action. Jesus saw people in need and he helped them. He didn't just sit back and go, gosh, I hope somebody helps them someday. And when he wasn't doing it himself, he was empowering other people to do it. And
Sure.
so it is this idea that we are meant to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world. And that is not some punchline political construct. That is what the gospel calls us to do. It's not weak, it's not woke, it's Jesus' work.
Mm-hmm.
And so when social justice and the striving for fairness and equity and mercy and compassion and kindness, when that gets reduced to a political punchline, it then becomes this point of us and them, instead of being an opportunity for Christ followers to live fully into what Jesus was inviting us to do, this beloved community where we take care of people.
Well, John, was there anything else you wanted to talk about from your sermon today or from your study in the social justice stream this week?
Still think about the earliest Methodists and Wesley. Wesley in his pursuit of holiness, was so methodical. That's where the name comes from.
Sure.
Is that his methodical approach to living out his faith, studying the scriptures, and getting with having this small groups. But the other piece of that was the action. And so Wesley, even as a student at Trinity College in Oxford, he would go and visit the prisons, especially like the debtors' prisons, where you owed somebody money and you couldn't pay it back, so they threw you in jail, which of course was this cycle of generational poverty and debt, because if you're in jail, you can't earn the money to pay back the debt. And so he would go into these debtors' prisons, he would pray with people that were there, and that was a part of him living out his faith. He eventually worked with some other people, and they created some of the first credit unions that we would know of today, where people could put their money on deposit with each other and earn interest off of those investments and then be able to pay each other back. That was a very kind of practical way of helping people break out of this cycle of debt. But that was a social justice kind of call. He started training pastors in medicine. And he actually has a medical book that many of the pastors would take with them, just basic remedies, nothing major, but just basic ways for these pastors who were going out and seeing these people to maybe tend to their physical needs and give access to health care. Okay. Because back in Wesley's day, if you were rich, a doctor would come to your house.
Sure.
If you were poor, you went to a hospital and you would certainly die there because of the rampant disinfections and antiseptical kinds of things. So, and then the Sunday school piece, he and others were finding ways to teach children how to read and write on Sundays when they weren't working in the fields or the factories, and they were using the Bible as a primer. And so these are all aspects of justice because it's helping make life better for people. And that is so deeply embedded in Methodist DNA, what it means to be a United Methodist. It's not exclusive to Methodist by any stretch, but it does drive a whole lot of who we are, which is why there are so many different ways of understanding ourselves as United Methodists. Some of my United Methodist friends are very, very, very steeped in social justice and active and advocacy, and always at a march and always at a protest and always doing these things. And this is how they live out their faith. Others may not take such an active stance, but there is inside of them this understanding and honestly this kind of realization of this mandate that we have, that to love God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our soul, is to employ our minds, our hearts, and our hands in the work of loving our neighbors. That's important to us, and however we live that out, I think if we're faithful to that, then like with all the other streams we've talked about, when we're faithfully seeking to live out our faith, God has a way of figuring out the rest of it.
Right.
And helping us to live fully into it. I think our step is to take a step and then trust God with the next step.
Well, and ultimately, when you think about it, all we are is stewards. all the resources we have, our very lives, are a gift from God. We're just here to try to do the best with it and manage it in a way that honors Him as best we can. And that seems like a noble pursuit in the social justice stream.
That is exactly right. And that's a great place to end. So thanks, Jeff. And thank you for tuning in to the 1135 podcast. Subscribe and like and share and tell your friends about it. We'll be back next week as we wrap up this particular series, the Faithway series. We'll talk about the incarnational stream and what it means to live sacramentally and of the awareness of God's presence. But until then, go out, friends, and seek to serve God in all that you do. Let the streams of justice flow. May people experience you living lives of kindness and justice and mercy and love.